Good morning and welcome to Law Talks here on 4CRB. Well, when someone passes away, many people assume there will be a clear will, organised paperwork and a straightforward process to follow, but that's often not the case. It's not uncommon for families to be left trying to piece together finances, dealing with unpaid bills, or discovering that important documents simply cannot be found. At a time when emotions are already running high, an added stress of trying to untangle someone's affairs can make an already difficult period even more overwhelming. So what happens when someone dies and their affairs aren't neatly organised? We're joined by Attwood Marshall Lawyers Partner and Accredited aged care professional, Debbie Sage. Good morning, Debbie.
Good morning, Robyn.
Well, Debbie, let's unpack this one. Is this something you see often, where families are left trying to piece together someone's affairs after they've passed away?
Yes, unfortunately, it is very common. Many people assume that there's going to be a neat file with the will, bank details, insurance docs, and everything's just clearly set out, when in reality, families are often searching through drawers, emails, old paperwork, online accounts, trying to work out what exists, who to notify, and what needs attention.
And what are some of the most common things families struggle to locate or understand after someone dies?
The most common issues are around locating the original will, finding all the bank accounts. Is there any superannuation still, insurance policies, property records? People don't realise a lot of that stuff is online now, but they're still trying to find title deeds. And then information about debts. I find in my practice, families often struggle to work out practical things like which bills are still being paid and have to continue to be paid after death, whether or not there's funeral bonds or prepaid funeral arrangements, whether there's any shares and investments, who needs to be notified. Even when the documents are found, they're not always easy to understand. People may have accounts in different names, old policies that no longer apply, which make it really confusing, or paperwork that's just never been updated.
And Deb, sometimes families also discover things they weren't expecting. Can you talk us through some of the surprises that can arise?
Yes, there can be quite a few surprises. The most common ones are unknown debts, credit cards that I didn't know existed, personal loans, Centrelink overpayments. And the big one lately is outstanding aged care fees that family just did not know existed, because sometimes they're going into care, they're having their assets and income assessed, so they don't know exactly how much they needed to pay, and then they've passed. So another issue is loans to family members and friends that was never properly documented. A family member may have helped a child financially over the years. After death, the family is saying, well, was that a gift or were you meant to pay that back? There's also business interests that no one knew about. You may have been a company director, shares in a business, or you had obligations under a partnership. Sometimes there's also unusual assets, cryptocurrency and gold. They're becoming way more popular now. And then things like firearms.
Oh.
I've had quite a few this year. So if a firearm is found, you need to handle that very carefully. It shouldn't, it should be, you don't just pass that on to a family member. In Queensland, there's strict laws around possession and transfer. So the executor needs to secure it. They need to contact the police or a properly licensed firearms dealer and deal with it lawfully. But then there's unregistered firearms. They need to be surrendered to the police straight away.
Okay. If there isn't a clear list of assets or debts, where do executors begin?
The executor should just start by gathering basics. That means locating the original will, obtaining the official death certificate, getting some identification documents for the deceased if you can find them, that helps, looking at recent mail, looking at bank statements, tax records if you can find them, any kind of property documents will help, and then just any initial information on super and insurance policies, because from there the executor can begin making a practical list. A list of the assets, a list of some liabilities and regular expenses, and then a list of the organisations that may need to be contacted to notify that the person's passed. It's often a matter of working through things methodically, checking back records, redirecting the mail, reviewing emails, contacting the deceased accountant or financial advisor if they had one, and also just identifying what they owned. How did they own it? Did they own it solely? Did they own it jointly? Did they own it through another structure, like a company or a trust? But as soon as you have those basics, you should always seek legal advice as soon as you can.
And Deb, I imagine this can also create tension within families, particularly if different people believe different things about what the deceased owned or intended. How often does that happen?
Oh, look, unfortunately, it happens a lot, especially when the will isn't clear or if there is no will. So disagreements arise when people have different they have different understandings of what was promised, gifts, loans, what they believe the deceased would have wanted. That tension is often made worse, as I mentioned, when there's no will or the will can't be found because records are poor most of the time. And especially when one family member has had more involvement in the deceased person's life or finances than others. So unfortunately, even small uncertainties can become emotionally charged after death. When someone's grieving, it doesn't take much to turn confusion into suspicion. That's why legal advice as soon as possible can make such a big difference.
And are there situations where delays happen simply because it takes time to track everything down?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's happening more often than not at the moment. Delays are not always caused by disputes. Sometimes it just simply takes time to identify everything, especially if the person wasn't well organised, had their affairs spread across different jurisdictions and institutions. There can also be delays just waiting for the death certificate. Sometimes there's a coroner's report that has to be made. Then there's responses from banks, super funds, governments, share departments. They all take time.
And all have their own process.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's probate. Depending on the value of the assets in the estate, institutions have their own thresholds. So a grant of probate of the will, so proving the will, is likely going to be required on average, which takes 3 to 4 months to obtain from the Supreme Court. And you can't avoid that. If institutions insist that the executor prove the will to ensure that the will they're giving them is the last will of the deceased, you've got to do that first.
Yeah, of course.
In many estates, delays don't necessarily mean something's wrong. It just means that there's a lot to untangle and there's a legal process you have to follow.
And what about digital assets like online banking or cryptocurrency, as you mentioned earlier? Is this becoming more of an issue now?
Yeah, it really is. These days, a person's financial and personal life, it's spread across phones, laptops, email accounts, banking apps, online investment platforms, social media, and then cryptocurrency wallets.
Yes.
So, the difficulty is families may know that the assets exist, but they don't know how to access them. There's passwords, there's two-factor authentication, there's privacy settings. You need your mobile phone. A lot of the time, people can't even get into that mobile phone to get the two-factor. With crypto in particular, if you don't have login details or recovery information is missing, those assets are impossible to recover. So digital assets are becoming a much bigger issue now, and they're easy to overlook. And unfortunately, they hold significant value a lot of the time.
Yeah, so for listeners, what are some of the simple steps people can take now to make things easier for their loved ones later on?
First is to make sure that there's a valid, up-to-date will and that the executor and its beneficiaries, if you want, to know where that original will is being kept. Now, the next is to prepare a simple asset and liability list, as well as your tax file number if you can. That's handy. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to be a clear summary of your banks. Write your bank account details down, superannuations, insurance, any property that you own in case it's not clear, and debts and important contacts. Okay. The third is keeping them all together. Put them in a folder, put them somewhere safe, including any details of prepaid funeral arrangements, any business interests, and any details of online accounts. I'm not saying to put your password and things like that down, but you need to let people know if you've got online accounts. And then, review things regularly. Life changes, relationships change, documents usually should keep up with that. So a little more organisation now can save loved ones a lot of stress later.
Yeah, I imagine updating documents, particularly insurance policies, they can change every year. So I guess it is important to keep things as up to date as you possibly can.
That's right.
So when someone dies, Deb, grief is hard enough without also having to solve a financial puzzle. And I think the message we've got today is the more organised a person is during life, the easier it is for their family to manage things after they're gone. Thank you for your insights and advice today, Debbie.
Thank you so much.